You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 78. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my friend. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Paula here, and I'm delighted to have you with me here this week. We have a wonderful and amazing guest. Her name is Bena Stock, and she is a lawyer turned counselor. Bena will be talking to us about emotional regulation, and she will be providing practical tips and strategies that you can use when you find yourself facing difficult emotions, whether at the workplace or outside of the workplace. So stay tuned. You are going to find this episode very helpful and, my guess, quite relatable. Now, before we dive in, I just wanted to highlight to all of you that in January of 2023, so a month, almost 2 months away, I'm going to be opening the doors to a membership program for women lawyers. In that program, we are going to take the coaching concepts that I've been discussing, that you've been learning about in this podcast, and we're going to apply them. We will go month to month looking at different themes and using the work that we're doing to help you achieve the goals that you set for yourself and overcome all the challenges and obstacles that stand in your way. So if that is something that is of interest to you, if you're looking for more career clarity, if you're looking to find a better balance in your life, if you find that you are struggling with certain challenges that keep coming up in your practice, this is a perfect opportunity for you. So if you're interested, stay tuned. I will be providing more information in the weeks to come. If you know already that this is something that you want to know more about, please reach out to me. You can send me a note. There's a form on the website that will be linked to on the show notes. You can also send me an email. You can send me a DM on LinkedIn. I'm very reachable and I would love to hear from you so I can share more about what this program is going to be. So with that, my friend, delighted to have you here this week. Enjoy today's episode and I look forward to reconnecting with you again next week. Bye for now. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. It is Paula here, and I'm so very excited to introduce you all to this week's guest. She is hands down amazing. Her name is Bena Stock. She is a lawyer turned counselor. She now works primarily with lawyers in her counseling practice. I have known Bena for years. I'm about to turn the mic over to her for a second. But before I did that, I just wanted to mention that I've known Bena for a few years now. She was one of the first people that I reached out to when I was initially thinking about my career as a lawyer and whether I wanted to stay on as a lawyer or if I wanted to do something a little bit different. And for all of you that are on that path, and I know there are a lot of you out there who are thinking about your options, whether it's options within law or options outside of law, it really does benefit everyone, I think, in the long run when you do connect. And Bena and I were put in contact through a mutual friend, and she was just amazing from the beginning. And so it is really, truly special for me to be able to bring her on the podcast today. We're going to be talking about emotional regulation, which is such a fabulous topic for everybody. So welcome everyone listening. Welcome, Bena. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for inviting me, Paula. I am so excited to be here. And thank you for that introduction.
Oh, it is so fun, Bena. So, Bena, I mentioned that you were a litigator, now a counselor. Would you please tell everyone who's listening a little bit more about yourself and the work that you do?
Absolutely. So I was a litigator for about 24 years and transitioned into counseling. And my practice has evolved such that I provide counseling primarily to people in the legal profession. So lawyers, law students, sometimes their partners. I do work with some non-lawyers as well. And that's one-to-one counseling. And it's been primarily through telehealth, which is kind of like Zoom during the pandemic and slowly moving to in-person. I also offer psychoeducational courses. And they have been primarily webinars, although I did speak in person for the first time in September in Calgary at the National Pro Bono Lawyers Conference. And it was so, so lovely to be back in person.
Amazing, Bena. And I have attended many of Bena's in-person trainings, and she is such a wonderful speaker. Bena, you have such a great way of engaging people and offering them exercises that they can do in the moment that really bring out those aha moments. Bena you were the one who introduced me to Kelly McGonigal's stress mindset. And that was a life-altering hour and a half that I spent learning from you. For everybody listening, the stress mindset concept was that how you perceive stress actually affects how stress is experienced in your body. So we will leave that for another day, but I credit Bena with some transformational learning. So yeah, it really is wonderful. I'm delighted to hear that you're not only doing the virtual counseling and speaking, but that you're also moving to in person. So that just sounds lovely. Bena, what was it like for you? I mean, you started out as a litigator and now you're counseling. What has it been like for you to transition from lawyer to counselor?
Well, it was a long journey. My undergrad was in psychology, and honestly, I fell into law. And I was so fortunate to be able to practice in an area that was somewhat connected to health. And I did medical malpractice for about 21 years of my career. And then over time, I found that the glacial pace of litigation and the constant conflict was wearing. And so I went in-house and I worked with the lawyers. It's now the Lawyers Indemnity Fund. Then it was the Lawyers Insurance Fund. And I found that the emotional toll that the lawyers who would be reporting errors or suspected errors was the part of the job that I was really connected to. Somebody would perhaps report an error on a Friday and their file would reach my desk on Monday, and I would connect with them. And over the weekend, they perhaps had slept very little. They would have torn their entire practice apart, looking for other possible mistakes that they may have missed. And they'd be really quite emotionally dysregulated. And I would say, well, look, it's okay. We've seen this before. We're going to do ABC and the outcome's likely going to be X, Y, Z. And it's my problem now and I'll take care of it. But it was that emotional piece that I really connected with. And I had dipped my toe in the water while I was still practicing in private practice with the counseling program. I decided I would sign up part-time and I would go to school all day on Saturdays. And I loved it so much. I was probably the most annoying student there to my cohort because I was so excited to be there. And I'd put a pin in that for a little while I went in-house. And my experience with the lawyers really led me to conclude this is what I want to do. So I try to walk the walk. I hired a counselor. I went to counseling. I hired a coach who specialized in transitioning lawyers out of law. I did a lot of self-reflection, and I decided to take the leap and went back to school full-time to get my master's in counseling.
Bena, thank you so much. That is such a beautiful story. It's funny because even though I'm not a lawyer and I'm not practicing and I'm not dealing with an insurance claim, when you said, you've come to the right place, I can help you, it's my problem now, I actually felt relief. Even just the way that you said it, I felt so relieved. And I can imagine that you were just so effective in that role. And what I love about what you just shared too, and this is for the benefit, again, of anybody who is thinking about their career, you talked about it being a long journey. You talked about kind of noticing within the work you were doing what it was that really resonated with you. You talked about dipping your toe, right? As you were still practicing as a lawyer, giving yourself the opportunity to take a course on the weekend and then walking the walk, really doing that deep work, that self-reflection as you made that transition. And I think it's really wonderful that you shared that story because I think for anyone who's struggling in their career and wanting that next move to be the right move or wanting it to happen in a hurry, I think what you've shared with us really highlights how it is a process that takes time, and allowing yourself that grace to just experience it one step at a time will ultimately lead you to where you want to be. And I'm just going to share this now because I think it's something that was so impactful for me. I mentioned at the beginning of our call that Bena was one of the first people that I reached out to when I was thinking of transitioning. And she told me about her work and how she felt pinch me happy. And at the time that we spoke, that just seemed kind of like I'd never heard anybody say that before. And so it opened up this new possibility of you can be pinch me happy doing your professional work. And I enjoyed my work as a lawyer, but this was something that was just different. So Bena, thank you for sharing that and for that comment that you shared with me many years ago now. Bena, you've highlighted some of the struggles that lawyers had in practice, particularly when they were making or potentially making insurance claims. And I would love to know maybe a little bit more broadly what some of the challenges are that you see among lawyers in practice.
Where to begin? I practiced for 24 years and had a lot of opportunities for a personal observation, some of the challenges. And when I think about, what's the first thing that comes to mind when I'm thinking of your question, for me, it would be the absolute overwhelm. That sheer volume of work can leave you feeling that you're always and forever playing catch up. And I certainly experienced that when I was practicing. My to-do lists were constantly being changed and reorganized. Difficult opposing counsel was sometimes some of the challenges for me, and I know it is now as well. I think that has become perhaps more difficult than it was when I was practicing, because I can honestly say that I can count on one hand the number of counsel who I would not correspond with in any way other than in writing. And I think that's pretty good after 24 years, but I understand anecdotally from working with lawyers that has changed. I think as well, one of the things that many people struggle with, and I was right in there with this, is the balance. Finding, whether you call it work-life balance or you call it work-life integration, is a word that I've been using more often than balance, that ability to find a sense of being able to enjoy your work and doing your work well, that doesn't detract from spending time with your friends and your family and really connecting with people that you care about. Especially if you are in a relationship and your partner is also really busy, it can be really a struggle. I know that, Paula, you and I have spoken about these things many times because we both have children. Mine are adults now and yours are still in school. It can be really hard. And I think trying to find that balance is something that many, many lawyers of all genders really struggle with.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right that those are some of the key challenges that come up as lawyers and as professionals. I'm no longer practicing law, but I sure have work-life integration, balance, whatever you want to call it. That is an ongoing negotiation. So love that. Thank you. Bena, I was really excited to bring you on today to talk a little bit about emotional regulation. I think it's something that we may not really talk about all that much, and yet I think it has such a great impact on how we practice. And so I would love for you to explain what it is and why it matters.
Absolutely. I think emotional regulation is really key. I'm going to launch into what my definition is just in a moment, but I want to put it in context and maybe put together the last question with this question, in the sense that when we're practicing law, and this is something that I see a lot in my counseling practice, is that sense of the lack of mentorship, the lack of support. There are many firms that provide a lot of formal mentoring programs, but there are some that don't, or perhaps if they do, the mentor is not that engaged. And I think that can really leave a lot of lawyers feeling very isolated. And that can sometimes contribute to a sense of increasing anxiety with uncertainty, not knowing really what the next step is. And there's such a huge learning curve in law. I mean, we call it a practice because we're always growing and learning. And if we don't have somebody to turn to, it can become overwhelming. And for some people, that anxiety can become paralyzing. And regulating your emotions, being able to recognize how they play a pivotal role in the way you show up at work and in your personal life, can really make a big difference. And we all go through the day experiencing different kinds of emotions, right? Some are good, some are bad. Some of them happen within our awareness, right? We can tell, okay, well, I've been really triggered is a word that many people use, but some of them happen outside of our awareness, right? We may find ourselves responding in the moment and then pause and think, wow, well, where did that come from? Who was that person? That wasn't me. So emotional regulation, in my mind, is when we are able to pause and reflect on when a situation occurs, it has an impact on how we feel, what our emotion is, and how we think about that situation. And those feelings and thoughts directly impact how we behave, how we respond, or how we react. It's a long answer to your question.
It is a beautiful answer to that question, Bena. Thank you. It ties together exactly what I was hoping we would be able to bring out in today's conversation, which is the connection between our emotional life, how we experience our emotions, and the impact it has on our practice. So you were giving some examples, right? Of, if you're feeling anxious, how does that play out? And maybe it's an action that you take. Maybe it's a lack of action that you take. And so I think for us to be able to have this conversation and for you to be able to articulate it so clearly, it will be so beneficial for all of us to start thinking about more consciously, more awareness of here's what I'm thinking, here's how I'm feeling, and I'm going to be more conscientious. I'm going to take that pause that you talked about and use that to be more intentional about how I'm going to move forward. So I am just so grateful for you for that beautiful definition. You touched on this already, but I would love for you to go a little bit more deeply into how emotional dysregulation might show up in a law practice.
In so many ways. When we're looking at emotional regulation, we're looking at sort of three components: inhibiting actions triggered by emotions, right? So you can probably think of many scenarios where you're practicing law. It would be helpful to inhibit your emotional reactions so that you don't become dysregulated. Initiating your actions. And you very astutely pointed to that as being one of the key elements in emotional regulation, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but there's been situations where not only just in practice, but in life where something has happened and I've sat there stunned and kind of shook my head. And, maybe 5 minutes later, I think, why did you not say something? How did you why did you not speak up, right? And then modulating your responses is the third component of emotional regulation. And that ideally is the best way that we can make the most of the regulatory process, because emotions are crucial to our survival. They give us vital information that tell us about ourselves, and they also tell us about our relationships. And when we're thinking of how it can show up in practice, just think of any time when you feel anxious or you feel overwhelmed and you have this automatic response to either shut down or perhaps to lean into the conflict. If we are not paying attention to our emotions, we can we can fall prey to our emotions where we're ruled by our emotions. Whereas the flip side, if we're well balanced and we're being intentional, I love that word, about how our thoughts and our feelings influence our behavior, we can respond with better judgment and better balance in any given situation.
100%. I'm loving every word, Bena. This resonates really strongly. And I think we can all imagine in our mind's eye situations where the emotions have started calling the shots, and maybe we've said things that we later regret or we freeze up, right? I think sometimes we feel so overwhelmed by our emotions that we're not even in a position to take action. So I think this resonates with all of us. We're all human, right? We all have emotions. And so this is such a wonderful way to think about it. And you talked about, there were three things. There was inhibition, there was modulating, and was the third responding? I'm not sure I caught that.
Initiating. Yeah, okay. That would be when we're stunned. So for example, just think of maybe, I suspect many of us have been in this situation. You're working with somebody, whether it's a colleague or somebody in authority, and maybe they lose their temper. They're short with you, or even worse, they yell at you. Hopefully, they're going to apologize and repair the relationship, and you can continue working together. But over time, if that behavior continues, then the apology starts to become a little insincere, and you slowly lose trust, perhaps, in that relationship. And the anger, the frustration that's exhibited begins to erode the foundation of the relationship. And maybe it's you who's the one who does that, who's dysregulated. And that's going to have lasting impacts on your relationship. So learning when you become dysregulated, what happens when you're dysregulated, and what you can do to bring yourself back down to baseline, so to speak, can be so valuable, especially in the practice of law. I mean, I was a litigator, and so conflict was, I don't know, a daily, regular occurrence, right? And I imagine that happens for our solicitors as well.
Beautiful. And Bena, you led me right to the next question, which is, what about law as a profession can set lawyers up for having a harder time than non-lawyers, for example, when it comes to regulating their emotions?
Well, lawyers tend to have a really high negativity bias. Everybody has a negativity bias, but ours is particularly elevated. We're really good at finding fault, identifying risk and errors. It's our job, and we're rewarded for it. So we continue to improve at that. And sometimes we do it without even trying. It just comes so naturally. And that can become problematic when we keep that lens, that way of looking at the world, and we bring it into our personal life and into our personal relationships. Nobody likes to be seated next to somebody who is, so easily finding fault, whether it's with you or with those around you. And that can lead to a lot of problems in relationships. And that's just who we are as lawyers. Not everybody, but many of us.
I 100% agree. And I've heard you talk about the negativity bias among lawyers before, and it is such a good point, especially where it's a profession that often rewards the finding of fault, right? If you're the person who catches the typo before the email goes to the client, or you catch the nit or the, much more than a nit, a really big problem that might be in a contract, you are rewarded for that. And so that negativity bias is really reinforced. And like you said, it's wonderful if you're the person catching the typo. If you're the one who's like, I can't stand eating dinner with you because you chew so loud, it's like, it's not necessarily going to be appreciated, nor is it going to help foster warm relationships. So thank you for that. There are different types of emotions, and I'd love to know from you. I mean, I think there are some emotions that may tend to paralyze people, and there are some emotions that are more triggers, right? That triggers in a more active way. Some of the emotions that I think would potentially cause people to freeze up, for example, might be stress, fear, self-doubt, anxiety. And I would love to know from you what you would recommend for lawyers who might find that they are not taking action because of those emotions that they're experiencing.
I've got lots to say on that. So I'll start and I'll make a couple of pauses. So the first thing I think that might be helpful for the listeners is just imagining how you would combine those emotions, the challenging emotions, with the negativity bias that we just talked about, because the negativity bias can also apply to ourselves. And just imagine a situation where you think that you've done something wrong at work. You've made a mistake. You've messed up. And you start to ruminate. You tell yourself, well, my boss is really angry with me and I'm going to get fired. It's just a matter of time before I'm tapped on the shoulder. And then you start to ruminate and you start to look for signs, evidence that supports this hypothesis, that supports your negativity bias, which is, I'm going to get fired. And sure enough, you find lots of it because you've got that mindset. We touched on mindset earlier, that people are really unhappy with what you're doing. And maybe, you start to think that I'm not good enough and I don't even belong in law. And so that came up quite often during the pandemic, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic when people were working completely from home. And in particular with associates, I think the people who were at the partnership level, people who had longstanding relationships, it was very different. You would just pick up the phone and have a conversation and there wasn't a barrier. But for some of the younger people, they might send an email and first thing in the morning and maybe not get a response until the end of the day. And meanwhile, during the day, they're starting to really fret and work themselves up into a frenzy and become really dysregulated. Maybe they're saying, geez, that email was stupid, or maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill. And then they find out that the person they sent the email to was, recovering from anesthetic because they'd had dental surgery earlier in the morning. Like, it was all for naught. And so that is something that I think is important for us to pause and to really think about, that we can be our own worst enemies when it comes to emotional dysregulation because of the stories we tell ourselves.
I think that's so powerful, Bena. And I really appreciate what you said about how you go and start looking for evidence to support your hypothesis. And as lawyers, we're all really great at building a case, even when that case is against ourselves, maybe especially when that case is against ourselves, because we see all the data and it's almost like looking at the world through that lens of what am I doing wrong here? And absolutely, if that's what your focus is on, then that's where your mindset is going to take you. So I really appreciate you explaining it that way. And I think that resonates with a lot of people, right? Especially as you said, pandemic, people are isolated, they're alone. For juniors, they don't have sort of that professional currency that they would have developed had they been more integrated earlier on. So I think that's really helpful. Those are emotions that might be more on the paralyzing side. And then there are the other emotions, right? Like the emotions that kind of, they trigger us and then we react and maybe overreact. So those might be emotions like frustration and anger or rage that compel us to act out and then later regret it. And I think especially for women, right? We have different societal expectations in terms of how we should behave. And so it's almost compounded. And I would love to hear your thoughts on what you recommend doing in those situations.
I think you hit on two really important things, and that's an important question. So the first thing to do is to stop, to pause, to pay attention to what it is that has caused you to feel that you're escalated. Just because you feel something doesn't mean it's true. And, we're recording this just after Halloween. And I don't know about you, but I don't watch scary movies. I think I stopped as a teenager because I just couldn't handle them. But I know a lot of people who have been consuming a lot of frightening movies and then hearing about how they're sitting at home feeling really afraid that something bad is going to happen. Well, just because you have a feeling, just because you have an emotion doesn't mean that something bad is going to happen. We call that emotional reasoning, right? I screwed up on a file. I'm an idiot. Well, no, one doesn't necessarily lead to the other. So what can you do to begin to make some change? We all have automatic reactions, and you and I have talked about cow paths in the past, and I know it's something that you like, and so I'll just explain this briefly. I like to offer interesting ways to make change for people, sometimes humorous ways, because I think that sometimes that'll create that pause so people will actually make the change. And the cow path story is about how cows have automatic reactions. They're creatures of habit. They follow a path to get to food or shelter, whether it makes no sense or not. And as humans, we all have our own cow paths as well. We all have our own go-to ways of responding. So the first thing to do is to pause and pay attention to when that comes up for you and how is it that you emotionally respond. And so a really concrete tool that I've been working with many clients, and they seem to find it really helpful. I was actually giving a talk, the one in person the other day, and I saw people frantically writing notes. So I want to share this with your listeners because I think it's a great strategy. I'd like you to think for a moment of a bell curve, just a standard bell curve. And you've got your baseline. And that's when you're ticking along and you're getting enough sleep and you're eating and you're exercising and work isn't too overwhelming and the kids are behaving and your relationships are going well. And then at the top of the bell curve, as far away from the baseline as we can get, that's when you're really dysregulated. That's when, and I like to externalize emotions that we want to work on changing or responses that we want to work on changing by naming them. And so maybe that's when your Tasmanian devil comes out, right? Taz is in the house. So I like to ask, what are you doing? What are you thinking? And what are you feeling when you're very emotionally dysregulated and when you're kind of meh, green? And also, most importantly, what are you doing, thinking, and feeling as you're going up the curve? So now you've got some warnings that I'm becoming emotionally dysregulated. I've got time to abort. And similarly, what's going to help you come down? What's going to help you leave the Tasmanian devil? So I don't know. Sometimes it can be helpful to use examples. I know for me, when I'm Taz, I am overfunctioning. I've taken on too much. That's what I'm doing. What am I thinking? I'm thinking, I can't possibly get everything done in the amount of time I've given myself. What am I feeling? I might be feeling overwhelmed. I might be feeling anxious. So that's what happens to me when I'm dysregulated. I know we talked a little bit about this beforehand, Paula, and you said you were game.
Yeah. No,
Would you like to work through an example?
Absolutely, Bena. And I mean, feel free to lead me with questions. I have a scenario in mind. I'm ready. Yeah.
Well, why don't we start at the dysregulation for you? What are you doing when you're feeling really dysregulated?
Yeah. And so I actually completely echo with the example that you gave. When I overwork, when I take on too much, when, that is certainly an example that I relate to. The one that I thought I would bring up based on our conversation earlier, and also the one that I struggle with the most is with my kids, right? I think, and I mentioned this, Bena, prior to our hitting the record button, I feel like in certain situations, like a professional setting, it's a lot easier for me to regulate, to really at least have the outward appearance of being regulated. Whereas sometimes when I'm trying to get the kids out the door in the morning, and I really try to make it pretty formulaic and everything happens the same way every morning. And yet I can tell you the last 3 days in a row, we have been struggling to get to school before the second bell. There's 2 bells and we're not alone. There are lots of other families. We see them on the route. We're kind of in a club together, but I do find that that is a situation where I really struggle to not lose my cool, right? I go from, okay, can we put your shoes on, please? Okay, have you brushed your teeth yet, please? Oh, okay, I'll go get your hoodie for you, etc. I go from that to like, we need to get out the door. And so that's probably an area where I struggle the most to actually keep my level of where I want to be. So my baseline, as you talked about, and my Tasmanian devil comes out and I'm just not who I want to be in those moments.
Yeah. Just as an aside note, we have shown up at school in pajamas because that's it. Patience is gone. You're going in your pajamas. Funny, it only happened once.
This is the thing. Yes. Natural consequences.
So when, you're not, I hear that you saying that you're not the person that you want to be. What are you thinking in those moments?
Yeah. And I've asked myself this many times. And it's a lot of should statements, right? We should be there. We're going to be late. And I don't know why I get so scared of being late. I think I was brought up to not be late. So in my mind's eye, it's like those horror movies, right? I think something terrible is going to happen. And I'm probably emotionally reasoning that because I feel scared, something bad, there's like a cauldron for all the parents of late kids, not the kids themselves. It's the parents, right? Because I'm feeling that weird sense of urgency of needing to be there. So I think the go-to feelings for me, it probably is urgency. It probably is that feeling of fear that something bad is going to happen. It's a frustration of, that constantly reminding, and maybe probably some resentment because I've packed all the bags and I've done my part and now I want everyone else to do their part. And I realize in saying this, I'm like, I love my children, right? They're sweet. They're wonderful children. I absolutely love them. So I don't mean to like pile onto them the responsibility of showing up to school on time. But those are some of the feelings that show up. And I think, yes, we're talking about it in the situation of me getting my kids to school, but I think those feelings are probably applicable in a lot of other situations, right? When we're overworking, when we're taking on too much, sometimes it's that resentment that comes up. When we take on too many deadlines, it's the fear that we're not going to meet them on time. So, it's a small example, but I think those feelings are the ones that show up.
Yeah. And I think the bottom line, if I can, say this for this conversation, is all feelings are valid and it's okay to have those feelings. It's just what we do about those feelings that is really important. So let me ask you this. When you think of in the yellow zone, either you're escalating because you're starting to, have those thoughts, the shoulds and, what's going to happen. Or maybe when you're trying to come down from the red, what are you thinking, doing, and feeling in those instances?
Bena, this is such a great question. And I think I'm just getting more tense, right? It's a slow build. It's, the first time I ask if everybody has brushed their teeth, I don't really feel anything at all. I'm like, okay, guys, here's your toothbrushes are ready. Brush your teeth. The second time I ask, there's that hint of, okay, why haven't you done it yet? Right? And stronger annoyance moves to irritation. And it builds from one piece to the next. And I want to add here, Bena, because I think what you gave as an example is a really compelling one, right? This idea that when we take on too much, that's when we can start to feel like, the dysregulation pops in. And what I want to highlight here is that in a morning situation, this all happens over the course of 15 minutes for me, right? This is a pretty short window. And what I think might be really useful for me coming out of this conversation is to notice these yellow marks on a much longer time frame, because when I end up overextended with too many things on my plate, it's because I've said yes on a very long road. And so the fact that we're having this conversation is highlighting to me that I should be looking for those yellow flags, not just in my morning routine, which is a work in progress, but also at a much broader level in terms of how I'm managing my professional and personal commitments. So this is really helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I mean, that's a really important takeaway that I think anybody who sits down and does this for themselves is likely going to have as well. And that's the point of it. What are my flags? What are my warning signs? What are my indicators when I need to go, okay, let's just check in here and start to be intentional. Let's use that word. It's a great word. And similarly, if I have been dysregulated, what do I need to do to come back down to base? And, that I guess leaves us the green zone, right? The baseline zone, which we'd all love to be working at, operating at all the time, but that's just not reality. But what do you know helps you stay at the baseline in the green zone? Like, what are you thinking and doing and feeling when you're down there?
Well, I'm in the green zone right now, Bena. I totally am. As you ask that question, I'm like, I feel amazing, right? I feel happy and really joyful that we're having this conversation. I feel seen, heard, understood. I feel like you're listening to me. I'm listening to you. We're engaged. We're talking about things that we love. So I think the green zone for me is a very content state, right? It is just feeling like, and it's not doing anything. For me, the green zone, sometimes it's resting, but mostly the green zone is where I feel the freedom to be choosing things that I want to be choosing. And that is like the greenest of the green, right? There's sort of like the medium green where I'm content, but I think it is that freedom and the cooperation and just feeling like if you're with people, that there's a certain recognition and almost like a validation of your emotions. You said there are no invalid emotions or some similar language to that. So I think all of that helps. And it doesn't mean that I necessarily need to be with somebody to be in the green zone. If I'm alone, chances are I'm in the green zone because, again, I've given myself that freedom to be doing things that I want to be. I'm accepting of myself as opposed to sitting in judgment of something that I said that I think, oh gosh, what if they think I meant it this way? And, that ruminating you were talking about, sending the email, ooh, like, what are they thinking that means? So hopefully that kind of answers the green zone. But I think those are the primary sort of thoughts and feelings. Like everything here is good. Everything is okay. I feel safe. I feel understood. And I'm enjoying this.
Thank you for being a sport and
this is so
letting me walk you through this because that's feedback I get so often from people is I want concrete strategies that I can put into place right now. And this is one of them. And so you played along and it was great. And something that some people also find helpful, and I mentioned externalizing, I called it the Tasmanian devil. Other people have referred to it as a dinosaur. You can call it whatever you want when you're in the red zone. If you feel comfortable, you can invite a partner, a friend, kids to help you identify when you're starting to become a Tasmanian devil, because we all have blind spots and this is a learning experience. And I can remember way back before I knew anything about this, one of my kids saying to me, Mommy, I think it's time for you to do the grouse grind. I live on the North Shore, really close to the grind. And clearly that's what helps me come to the green zone. And she called me on it. And that's helpful, right? What we're really talking about here is cognitive behavior therapy in essence, right? We've cognitive behavior therapy. Many of our listeners have probably heard about it, but in a nutshell, it's what we think about a situation. So a situation occurs, we have an automatic thought. That thought leads to an emotion, and those thoughts and emotions influence our behavior. And I put it in that context because a lot of lawyers I work with also really appreciate that linear, concrete way of looking at things. Another thing that I often use that people find helpful when we're talking about emotions is a wheel of emotions. I remember the first time I was asked how I felt about something when I was in my counseling program, I honestly paused and I said, I actually haven't thought about how I feel about something in so long. I can tell you what I think, I can tell you what my opinion is, but how I feel, I don't know. And so quite often I'll ask that question of clients, and I'll say, look, I'm sending you a wheel of emotion. Take a look at this, because there's a multitude of options there. And when we're able to name and really identify what that emotion is, we're much better able to regulate it. There's a psychiatrist named Dr. Daniel Siegel who talks about this a lot, and he's coined the phrase name it to tame it. And that can be a huge gift. So you can find a wheel of emotion on Pinterest, on anywhere online. Email me, I'll send it to you. But a lot of people find that really helpful too.
Bena, I think this is so helpful. And I had a little glitch on my end, but it sounded, it was name it to tame it. Is that right? Daniel
That's
Siegel.
right.
And I just want to recap here, Bena, because I think you've offered some really helpful tools. So what you took me through as an exercise, if we start with the sort of the pieces of the cognitive behavioral therapy, we have the thought, the feeling, and the behavior. And I think that's such a powerful tool for increasing awareness, right? When you can sit and look at any situation and identify what you were thinking, what you were feeling, and what you were doing in that situation, it gives you that awareness, right? And you talked about emotions and naming them, right? Again, you're externalizing that emotion and looking at it from, it's almost like you're the outsider or the observer looking at the emotion, and it gives you that distance so that you can get access to that more thoughtful or green zone way of thinking about something. And maybe that will help you get that distance that you might need if you're pausing, right? If you're really trying to be reflective and say, okay, I can see I'm going into the red zone. What's happening here? I think having that framework, the thought, the feeling, the behavior is just a really neat way of being able to compartmentalize it in a really linear way. So I love that. And I think the exercise that you took me through where we took that and we went, okay, what are you thinking, feeling, and doing when you're in the red zone, the yellow zone, the green zone? I think for everybody listening to even just spend a few minutes, hit pause on the recording and map that out for yourself, just that exercise of increasing awareness, it just makes us so much more conscious, right? As you said, when somebody asked you for what are you feeling? I'm kind of in a similar boat. I'm not a counselor, I'm a coach, but man, if you'd asked me what my feelings were 5 years ago, I wouldn't be able to name very many feelings. Whereas now I see why they matter and I have a much broader lexicon when it comes to identifying them. I see why it's important to be able to identify them and get granular about them. And so for everybody listening, especially as lawyers, right, where we're taught to look at the facts, we're not really so interested in feelings, but we should be, right? And I mean should in not a shameful way. Like should is could with a shame or whatever. I don't mean it like that. I just mean it as there's a whole world that opens up when we allow ourselves to explore what emotions can mean, how they play into our day to day. And so I love what you're sharing with us, Bena, because I think that's really inviting us to do that work. So thank you. Those are some really amazing concrete tools. And I see you have another thing to add, please.
Yes, I do. There's two other things that I want to throw in the mix that some people find helpful. And the first is it can also be really helpful to connect to your values. And, sometimes we may respond in a way that is not in accordance with what our true core values are. And that can really be a motivator to encouraging us to change our behavior. Anger is the first one that comes to mind, right? It's corrosive. And so if I don't want to be corrosive in my relationships, then I need to step back and really try to manage my anger. The other thing that can be really helpful is also identifying your vulnerabilities. And we all have them. And that's in a way similar to, the yellow and red exercise we went through, but it can sometimes be more concrete. And so when I'm working with anger management, I will often ask people, what do you find makes you more vulnerable? And I know for myself, it's if I haven't eaten regularly, I'm a grazer. I need to eat every couple of hours. And so if I go for a long period of time without food, I find that I can become less patient. I'm putting it very politely, we're pretty crappy. And so I just need to eat regularly, or I need to sleep regularly. And so you can get really concrete and use that as intel to help you to be more intentional about regulating your emotions.
I love that. And Bena, I'm going to pause here for a second because I think for us and for everybody who is listening and thinking about their own vulnerabilities, that is such great data to have about ourselves. And so I'll share a couple of mine. If you have others maybe that you've learned of through your counseling work that might be helpful. Obviously, it's not exposing confidentiality. We're not saying who feels what, but you mentioned making sure that you have had adequate meals, sleep. Those both ring true for me, more sleep than anything. I know when again, going back to overcommitting, when I've said yes to more things than I can reasonably put into my calendar, when I say yes to the things that I don't truly want to do, if I start, and that goes back to your values, right? If I start noticing, because I'm pretty clear on my values now, having done that work. And so if I find that I'm drifting off course and I'm spending my time, energy, my focus on things that don't align, I start to get more resentful. And so being able to know ahead of time, that's likely, or I know at night, right? After a full day, I'm not at my best. I have a very short window or a capacity. I just kind of just need to go to bed, right? Like that's kind of, I'm done. Like, I've been on all day. Like, so I know that I need to go to bed early and I like to read in bed if I can. So those are some of the areas where I would identify for myself as being more vulnerable. And I'd love to know if there's any sort of common vulnerabilities that listeners might relate to when they're thinking about how it might show up for them.
Well, it's interesting because the ones that you've shared and the ones that I've shared are the most common ones that I hear about and we talk about, and sleep being, right up there. And there tends to be a bit of it becomes somewhat of a badge of honor sometimes in law. I billed, 140 or 200 hours this month, which means that, I only sleep 5 hours a night because I can get away with it. That's all I need. Yeah, but you're crabby and you're really unpleasant to be around. And, sleep is one of those things that you need to make regular deposits. You can't just be a weekend warrior when it comes to sleep and sleep until noon. And I can't remember when I last slept till noon, but sleep until noon and play catch up.
People do that?
Yeah, it's the overcommitment. It's, really struggling with boundaries. Sometimes it's also when we're in challenging relationships that can be really taxing on people and that can make us more vulnerable in one way or the other, right? We can become overwhelmed, we can start to shut down, or we can become, angry and lash out. But I think we've hit the highlights. There are others, I'm sure, but we've hit the highlights.
Yeah, beautiful. There's one that I'm going to add, and then we have time for one last question. And then I'm so sad we're going to have to say goodbye. And that is, I think, unrealistic expectations. And that's one that I know for myself sometimes is a trigger. And it's not just our vulnerability. It's not just me expecting someone else. It's also, and sometimes even worse, when it's an expectation of self that goes unmet. So I know I've experienced that, and I've known others to experience that as well. So I think that's one that we can maybe add into the list that just came to mind as you were talking. So Bena, this is our last question. And so here it is. In putting on a counselor's lens and seeing lawyers from that perspective, what has been your biggest aha in terms of how lawyers practice? Put another way, what do you wish every lawyer knew about themselves, about how the brain works, about emotional regulation that would help them most in their practice?
It is an aha that I had for myself and that I share regularly. And it is this: you are not your thoughts, and not all of your thoughts are true. I know that sounds like a catchy phrase, but break it down. And it's connected to the emotional regulation piece that we've talked about. And we've talked about emotional reasoning. You're not your thoughts. Just because you think that, you've made mistakes on a file and that means that, you're going to lose your job, that's not true. So really pausing and questioning what you're thinking, because you actually are the boss of your thoughts. I'll throw that one in too. That's a good one. So that's my huge, huge aha moment and takeaway that I'd like to share with our listeners. It can be so valuable.
It is so powerful and so beautiful. And I think piggybacking on the thought, feeling, action connection, when you start poking holes, and you and I have talked about this before, and I've seen you present on this before, and I've talked about distorted thoughts on the podcast before, right? When you start going through a list of the things that you're thinking and asking yourself, is it actually true? And it's amazing what you can unravel when you take your thoughts, put them on paper, and start actually challenging them. Because like you, Bena, that's a big aha that I've also had in the work that I've been doing. And it's incredible how much power that gives you in your practice, in your personal relationships, in the way that you relate to yourself. And I don't know why we don't know that intuitively, at least why I didn't know that intuitively, but it is a game changer. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing that as your aha moment. I think that's super powerful. So before we fully wrap up, Bena, I would just love for everybody who would like to reach out with you, work with you, connect with you, maybe you can let us know where we can find you, and feel free to let us know what you are doing these days. It sounds like you're counseling, you're teaching, you're doing webinars. It sounds like you have recorded courses coming up. So over to you.
Thank you for that, Paula. The easiest way to find me is to go to my website. That's www.benastock.com. I had no trouble purchasing that domain name because there's no other Bena Stocks. And just Google my name. You'll find me that way. I am doing a lot of counseling. And so, if you do reach out and you see my calendar is full, please email me and we'll talk about, whether, I can put you on the wait list and how long that might be, or if I'm going to refer you to some of my other amazing colleagues out there who are former lawyers, who are counselors and psychotherapists as well. And yes, I also do a lot of psychoeducational webinars or in person. And that the easiest way to reach me would just be to email me and let me know that you're interested in presenting to your organization, your firm. And then we can start a conversation and look at what your needs are so I can ensure that I can meet them. I'm not on any other platforms just yet. So that's the best way to find me.
Beautiful. I love it, Bena. Thank you again for being here today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this conversation. It has been so much fun. I'm definitely in the green zone and hope all of you listening are as well. And thanks again, Bena. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me, Paula. I had so much fun. The time just flew by, and it's always a delight to talk to you.
Me too. I'm already brainstorming topics to bring you back. Okay.
My pleasure.
Thank you again. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.